Well, good evening, Africa. Good evening, world. Welcome to this session. My name is Solomon Serwanja, and special greetings from all the people in East Africa, and that is to say Uganda, to be exact, from a chilly cold Kampala, which is session, and discuss with a team that carried out an investigation that has left many of us questioning the different humanitarian agencies and what they're doing in the different parts of Africa, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The topic tonight is how we uncovered widespread sexual abuse allegations against Ebola aid workers. This was an in-depth investigation that has ruffled feathers. WHO in that issue is investigating its staff, and there's been several international investigations that have been launched against the different people who are mentioned in the report. This was an investigation that took a year of research. We are so privileged today to have the people who actually participated in this investigation, and they're going to be sharing with us their experiences. How did they do it? And we are so honored today to be discussing with, I'll start with introducing our panelists today, and that is Paisley Dodds, who is working with the New Humanitarian as its first investigations editor, about a year, of course, and she then has been working as a journalist in different sessions, including, by the way, she has been working with she has a bulk of 25 years career where she worked with the Associated Press. She joined AP in 1994 in South Africa, and then later on worked in Miami, Little Rocks, and Boston bureaus before joining the international desk in New York. From there, she was promoted to the Caribbean news editor, leading coverage across the region and reporting on such stories as the rebellion that ousted the president in Haiti. Then he was Jean Bertrand. And of course, she's a celebrated journalist, and right now she's working with the New Humanitarian. Also, we will be speaking with Robert Flumefelt, who is an investigative journalist and independent researcher based in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He has been working nearly for 3 years there. He has experience in documentary filmmaking and, of course, documenting human rights abuses, including sexual abuse and exploitation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting to share your thoughts with us and how you nailed this investigation. First, let me invite Paisley to talk to us about how they were able to do this investigation. Paisley, you're welcome.
Thanks, and it's very humbling to be here. As you pointed out, I actually started my career in Johannesburg in 1994, probably a little bit sooner than some of you were born. So my name is Paisley Dodds. I'm the investigations editor for the New Humanitarian. I'm based in London. I started with the New Humanitarian last year. As you pointed out, I worked for Associated Press for more than 20 years before I joined TNH. I was its London bureau chief for 10 years. I also led some of our investigations on UN peacekeeping abuse. I reported all around the world, from Haiti to Afghanistan. And before I moved to London, I also reported on the US prison camp in Guantanamo. So over to my colleague, Robert.
Robert is an investigative journalist and an independent researcher who is based in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he has worked for 3 years. Robert has experience in documenting human rights abuses, sexual abuse and exploitation, as well as corruption, having investigated security forces, and of course, UN agencies. Robert, again, thank you so much for accepting to be part of this session today.
And thank you so much. Definitely, it is a privilege to be here. As you had talked about, I've got about 3 years experience here in East Congo. You said in the introduction, hello from chilly Kampala. It's incidentally also pretty chilly here in East Congo. Today, a little rainy in South Kivu, but very happy to be here. In East Congo, the context that I'm most familiar with is Beni territory, which for those who do not know, in Beni territory, there have been, since the end of 2013, thereabouts, mass killings that many community members in Beni feel have been overlooked by the international community, international media, so forth. So that has been of particular interest in my about 3 years here in Congo. And of course, additionally, from around 2018, middle of 2018, there was this Ebola outbreak, one of the hotspots of which was Beni, the other major hotspot being Butembo. And Beni became a major sort of locus for different responders. And throughout areas where this response was working to contain the virus, there were widespread community grievances, which were of particular interest for me, really from the beginning of my work in Congo, sort of drilling into those community grievances, one of which, as we'll discuss, proved to be widespread sexual abuse and exploitation on the part of responders.
Good to have you, Robert. We have two celebrated investigative journalists who have a big experience in covering such reports. So I'll start with you, Parsley. How did you come up with this investigation? Could you maybe take us through?
Sure, I'm happy to. I actually have a little presentation to show everyone. So if you forgive me for a brief moment, I am going to try to share my screen with you all. Just 1 second. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, I think we can see.
That's great. Again, forgive any technological problems. It's also quite rainy here in London, although chilly sort of goes with the territory. So you asked how we got to the investigation, but first I'd like to at least spend a little bit of time for anybody who doesn't know who the New Humanitarian is. A little bit about us, in case you don't know our background. We actually started as ERA News in the wake of the Rwanda genocide in 1995. We were founded by the UN. The thinking back then was that on-the-ground reporting of humanitarian crises could actually avert future disasters. 20 years on, that thinking hasn't really changed. We still do the same thing that we were doing in 1995, but better. And we're also completely independent. If you see from the slide above, what we have been doing recently, at least in the last few years, is we're increasingly also working with partners. I think it's important to say, before we talk about the investigation, we also partnered with the Thomson Reuters Foundation for this specific investigation. Just in terms of our audience, as you see from the slide, we have a pretty big audience, professionals, journalists, researchers, students. As social media becomes more of a distribution platform, a lot of our stories and audio are also getting out on social media. And the really exciting news is that we have a growing audience in Africa. So we've been very, very happy to see that in the last year. A few things worth noting on this slide that you're looking at. I don't think that most people really understand how big the humanitarian sector really is. Some estimates say that it's worth between $1 billion to more than $150 billion. If you look at international development, that's a pretty big chunk of change, and it really drives a lot of the investigative work that we do, because at the end of the day, a lot of this money is coming from taxpayers like all of us. It also means that if that money isn't being used the way that it should be, the people who need it the most are not getting it. The other thing that I'd like to make a point about on this slide is that, the New Humanitarian is a very small operation. We only have 10 full-time editorial staff, which means that we're very, very selective in the types of investigations that we do. But it also gives us an enormous room for growth, particularly with reporting collaborations. I think that everyone has seen the headlines, whether it was our headline recently or whether it's been other headlines about sex abuse. I think that we all agree that we would rather not be writing these headlines, but we're also happy that the story and specifically this investigation that we did, seems to be having a lot of impact. One of the things that we really realized about this, the more reporting that we did, was that it went well beyond the scope of what we imagined. It also made us realize how much work we still had to do and still are doing. You know, like a lot of investigations, this evolved from our consistent coverage in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and specifically on the Ebola outbreak. Many of you have been covering as well. Robert can speak a little bit about this, but you know, we first started hearing rumors last year when we were on the ground in Beni and Butembo, to the outbreak zones. Some people, some community members had started talking about the fact that women were being lured into sex for work schemes, but we also heard rumors that Ebola survivors, specifically female Ebola survivors, were also being sexually exploited by psychological counselors who were supposed to be giving them help. Hearing about such abuse didn't come as a complete shock to us, unfortunately. We've consistently reported on sexual abuse and exploitation within the aid sector for years. Some of those abuse scandals have included the UN peacekeeper abuse in Haiti, the Oxfam scandal in Haiti, UN peacekeeper abuse in Central African Republic, and recently alleged sexual exploitation in Uganda. In terms of our Ebola coverage, you know, we've really tried to consistently cover Ebola from the time that it started up until its end, and we're certainly planning new stories on the current outbreak. One of the layers that we have been trying to uncover within that coverage has been how the disease has affected communities. And, you know, one of the things that we came across during the course of our investigations on Ebola was looking at what had become the Ebola business. One of our reporters did an investigation last year that really looked at community grievances that were coming out of the response. And Robert can talk to you a little bit about some of the rumors that he had been hearing that were also evolving out of that response.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is really important, and indeed part of the reason I've been happy to work with an organization like TNH. Very, very early on in the response, I had been hanging around in one of those two hotspots I had mentioned, Butembo, where at the time, so much international coverage, you know, there were these attacks that were formal and informal attacks that were being conducted against responders and against the response overall. These ranged from, you know, organized militia attacks, people going and burning down Ebola treatment centers, to informal attacks, people lobbing rocks at responders and so forth. And so much international coverage at the time was really sort of framing the people of East Congo as just a load of, you know, irrational people. They don't understand how helpful these responders are and how great how great the response is and so forth. As I had mentioned, I was really sort of interested in a time of talking to people about the grievances that were circulating and the reasons that communities were so deeply distrustful of the response. And three of the main reasons that people articulated to me when I talked to them were this sort of conception of an Ebola business or Ebola profiteering, were militarization associated with response, responders arriving in convoys, arriving in trucks with Congolese armed forces or even with UN peacekeepers. And finally, people beginning to talk about sort of, oh, you know, they come, they take our women, you know, the responders come into clubs, they flash around their money, they treat our women like prostitutes, so forth. And what the New Humanitarian has done, you know, in part through this most recent investigation, but in part through investigations from other journalists like Emmanuel Freudenthal, is actually piece by piece tease out the fact that there was, you know, a level of reality to each of those grievances, demonstrate that there was, in point of fact, profiteering that
Paisley, can you just come in there? I think Robert is frozen.
Yeah,
Sure, I think that
Robert, I think we lost you. Yeah. So let me just ask Vasily to come in and
sure.
yeah.
Sure, thank you. I think that the rain in DRC is getting to us, to all of us. So thanks for that, Robert. I hope that he can come back soon. So going back to how a lot of our previous investigations really laid the groundwork for our most recent one. Another the investigations that we did. From Philip Kleinfeld looked at widespread corruption and fraud within the aid sector within Congo. A bonus out of that investigation was the fact that we got a leaked report that also detailed the degree of sexual abuse and exploitation within the aid sector with aid workers in the Ebola outbreak. So as we started considering how big this story was, we also started planning for how we were going to report it. Obviously, the pandemic came along, and that threw a few roadblocks in the way, but we persevered and we started putting a plan together. Robert will hopefully talk to you a little bit about this afterwards, but one of the greatest considerations that I had and that all of us had was how to do the investigation safely, and particularly how we would conduct interviews discreetly, and to make sure that we were keeping the women safe, and to make sure that we were keeping their identities safe for the ones who wanted to speak to us anonymously. And Robert can talk to you a little bit more about some of the preparations that he made as a reporter on the ground, and what we did to really make sure that we protected those women.
Yeah, for sure. And hopefully the internet doesn't crash on me this time. So definitely this was, especially with sensitive subject matter such as this, and considering the abject stigma and real fear of retaliation that many of our sources understandably felt. Protecting our sources was really key, and protecting their anonymity was really key, sort of in two important respects, one of which is, simply ethical. Obviously, as journalists, first, we want to do no harm, especially when reporting on sensitive issues such as this. But second of all, actually, on sort of pragmatic grounds, people absolutely were, from very early on, had a lot of trepidations about talking to us, and only were willing to talk to us if they were assured that we would take stringent steps to avoid publishing any details that may betray their identities. So touching on a couple of those, Paisley already addressed them, but touching on a couple of those steps that we took, unfortunately, protecting people's identities in part meant we had to withhold the identities of our collaborators on the ground, which is important to mention. I worked with a number of trusted Beni-based researchers who I have a long history of working with on other issues like those mass killings that I had talked about, who have that sort of community trust, which was really, really key in finding people who were willing to share their stories with us. And unfortunately, for reasons of their security, as well as for reasons of protecting the identity of our sources, they had to choose to remain anonymous when the story was published. Additionally, importantly, especially as we began going to these various organizations that were implicated in the accounts that we were receiving, these organizations were coming to us, understandably, wanting more information about the allegations, what was the age and, the nationality or even the name of the accusers and so forth. And we had to make a decision on our part, though in many cases, women did, say, this person was this old from this country, he was called this, a lot of specific information. We had to withhold that information from those organizations. And as we'll address later on, pursue other means to try to present sort of routes to justice for the women that we interviewed.
Right. And as Robert started doing a lot of the reporting, and as we gathered testimony after testimony after testimony, The next challenge for us was really figuring out the storytelling process and how we could best not only tell the stories of these women, but also do them the service of telling the stories within their own words. One of the ways that we did that was by collecting the word by word testimonies from the women, speaking as they told the stories, and then turning those transcripts into actual audio clips. So you could actually hear the women's voices, even though they were being spoken by actors. So we have a couple clips that hopefully may work. If they don't, we'll go on to the next slide.
He told me to come to his hotel, and I felt a little afraid. We had heard strange things about these foreigners. We don't understand why they care so much about Ebola when we are dying from massacres. In the room, he looked at me and was silent. Then he said, "You can get a job with WHO if you have sex with me." I didn't want to, but I thought I couldn't choose. Work was most important, so I obliged.
And we have just one more.
He told me to come to his.
To show you.
He told me to meet him by the pool at his hotel for some drinks so we could discuss the job. I've never worked for an NGO, so I didn't know what was normal. And he said, "You want work? We have openings, but there is a condition. We make love tomorrow and you start work. You refuse, you get nothing."
So you get the point in these.
He told me to meet
Sorry
him.
about this. It was very, very difficult knowing that we weren't going to be able to get pictures of the women, being conscious of protecting their identities. It was also quite difficult, obviously, to get video. So I think that we did a pretty good job in trying to capture some of the women's stories in their own voices as they told this, as they told it to us. I think it's probably more important for you to hear from Robert right now in terms of the overall findings of the investigation, because some of them were quite shocking to, I think, all of us and to the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, for those who haven't seen the article, we ultimately spoke to 51 women in total who shared with us really harrowing accounts of various forms of sexual abuse and exploitation on the part of various responders associated with the Ebola response. In particular, vast majority of descriptions implicated men working for the World Health Organization. And the vast majority of cases would fall within the rubric of what might be described as sex for jobs schemes. However, these were really sort of pernicious and aggressive and predatory sorts of behaviors that were described to us. For instance, men sort of going to recruitment fairs where women trying to work for, the bottom tier of the response, women trying to work as cooks or cleaners or individuals who would stand at hand washing stations, would go and stand sort of at the General Hospital in Beni and see if their names were listed on these lists that would be generated of people who would be hired by the response, and individuals, mostly foreigners, working with the response, as per the descriptions that we received, would sort of target visibly disaffected women who are visibly upset because their names didn't make it on the list, would go up to them and say, "Hey, give me your phone number and we can talk about getting your name on the list next time." Would call the women, say, "Come and meet me at my hotel, we can talk about this." In many cases, the men would say, "Come to my hotel room," still just saying, "Let's talk about getting you a job," then close the door, lock the door, and say, "You need to have sex with me right now if you're going to receive a job with the response." In many cases, the women would subsequently receive a job in most cases with WHO or other organizations associated with the response, UNICEF, IOM, also NGOs like Alima, World Vision. And in a number of cases, women who are working with an organization like WHO were told at the end of every month, you need to have sex with me again or you're going to lose your job, sometimes at the end of every week. In other cases yet, women were told they'd receive a job with, say, the World Health Organization if they slept with a responder. They did so and then ultimately did not receive a job. And so there was a gradation as far as the various forms of sexual exploitation and abuse that were described to us. But all in all, what we documented through our reporting, I believe, was widespread, really systemic sexual exploitation and abuse. I can get into, not sure if Paisley thinks I should address it here, I can get into sort of the dynamics on the ground of going through the investigation, or perhaps that's best to address a little bit later.
Sure, I can keep going if assuming that this isn't boring people to tears. So Robert was talking a lot about the on-the-ground reporting. While Robert was diligently doing reporting, and while another reporter from Thomson Reuters Foundation was also doing reporting in DRC, we were also reaching out to various organizations who had been working in the response and asking them to give us numbers of how many SEA complaints that they had received during the near 2-year Ebola response. We didn't know what we were going to find, but what we did find was pretty shocking. Compared to the more than 50 women who Robert and the TNH reporter and the TRF reporter, talked to, we also found that the organizations, most of the organizations, tallied hardly any, if at all, complaints against workers during the response. That raised a lot of red flags for us, frankly. Some, like the World Health Organization, for example, outright refused to give us details, saying that they only released global tallies each year and didn't specify allegations that came out of specific emergency responses. In the end, we surveyed about 30 different organizations. And again, the lack of data that we were given in this 2-year period really told us two things. We already knew that women were not coming and reporting the allegations for a myriad of different reasons. But it was also pretty clear that although most community members and a lot of aid organizations and a lot of aid workers knew that the situation was going on the ground, nobody had said anything. No one came forward. And if you look at this table, this table also indicates that there were very few, if any, whistleblower complaints about any of the sexual abuse and exploitation claims that we were hearing about on the ground. A lot of our reporting also talked to experts in the field, many of whom had been working in different emergency situations around the globe. Some of those included whistleblowers like Anders Kampas, who was involved in the Central African Republic sex scandal by blowing the whistle. And a lot of them offered numerous reasons why this situation keeps unfortunately happening. Robert can also talk a little bit about this. The other interesting finding that came about in this investigation was that we found out that most of the people predominantly in decision-making roles were men. The WHO was more than 80% men during the Ebola response. This was also something that we hadn't really expected, but it also has raised a lot of questions within the aid community itself and within the donor community in terms of whether whether putting more women into decision-making roles in emergency responses could actually change the outcome. Robert, I'm not sure if you wanted to say anything about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And sort of dovetailing off that and circling back a little bit to some of the other important findings in terms of talking to those organizations, one thing that we really sought to do in our reporting was sort of drill into causes behind this, and furthermore, sort of drill into, well, talk to a lot of people who worked with the response itself. And that sort of produced, outside of the women themselves who are presenting these accounts, but other individuals working with the response, men working with the response, who absolutely described a certain culture about the response, definitely a sort of aggressive, male-driven culture, but also sort of described this interesting dynamic where it seemed like basically almost everybody knew what was going on, a sort of dynamic of like an open secret. So for instance, we spoke to drivers who drove vehicles for the World Health Organization. And those drivers described being sent in marked WHO vehicles to pick up women, to be ferried to hotels, to be subjected to these forms of exploitation and abuse. Furthermore, we interviewed, off the record, senior officials associated with the response who said, yeah, well, we sort of knew this was happening. We're happy finally somebody's talking about it. And most importantly, we conducted interviews with the women who described these forms of abuse and exploitation happening at a handful of major hotels in Beni and in some cases Butembo, where the response was based, where there are offices of World Health Organization, UNICEF, and other outfits within the response, and where even senior officials would stay if they were coming to town. And so we sought to, through our reporting, also sort of tease out this dynamic of a sort of open secret, and we did that by talking to other individuals who were aware of what was going on, but didn't obviously blow the whistle or talk about what was going on, who were associated with the response.
Thanks, Robert. So the next slide just basically shows how much impact we've had so far. We, of course, are going to be following the outcome of the investigations that are happening on the ground right now, that are being conducted by the UN agencies as well as the NGOs who were accused by the women who we spoke to. The Congolese president has vowed also to investigate. We've given evidence to the UK's Development Committee recently. And I'd like to believe that this came out of our investigation, but the UK recently changed its guidance prohibiting staff from having sex with aid recipients, which I have to be honest, I thought that was long prohibited, but apparently not. Robert can also talk a little bit about the impact that we've had on the ground in Congo. We were very happy to understand that a lot of the audio clips that we worked so hard to produce, some of those were played on Congolese radio. We also put a lot of effort into translating Thomson Reuters Foundation did put a lot of effort into translating the investigation to French, so we would hit a lot of countries in Africa. Robert, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Definitely. Yeah, suffice it to say, definitely the story got a lot of radio play throughout the Congo, generated a lot of conversation. Of course, people I talked to, sort of in Butembo and Ben, it's this sort of dynamic where it seems the international community in the world is the last to know about these things. So, the people I talked to are like, well, good to know finally the radio is talking about the things we've all been talking about, since the middle of 2018. So definitely affirming in some respect, generated a lot of conversation. Very importantly, there are a number of Congolese media outlets that actually drilled deeper into the story, conducted their own interviews with news sources on the ground as well. And so definitely it generated a lot of conversation in these areas and throughout East Congo.
Thanks, Robert. And I've just put a tip sheet out that might be helpful for some of the people in the audience. The thing that I'd like to stress on this is probably the last point. Obviously, after we broke this investigation, we have been getting a lot of calls from organizations asking for more information from the women so they could actually prosecute some of the alleged perpetrators if they found that any of the abuse was illegal. We've also been asked for additional information from organizations who are very curious about the alleged perpetrators that the women identified. That's been quite challenging. So I would recommend that if anyone does these types of investigations, that they try to think about what the long-term plan is in terms of how you can actually help survivors and where you draw the line in terms of what you won't hand over to organizations who are being accused. Robert can probably say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that was obviously really difficult because in a perfect universe, one would be very happy to sort of provide a lot of information to these organizations. However, it definitely couldn't be the case that we make such stringent commitments. We tell women that we're absolutely not going to share sources and so forth. And then we jettison all that after we drop a really big story. And importantly, decisions were made on the parts of actually all of the women that we spoke to not to report to these organizations in the first instance for a myriad of reasons, in part because they're worried about stigma just among people they know, in part because they felt victimized by the organizations as a whole. But suffice it to say that we could not, work directly with those organizations, go behind those women's back and provide that information. So what we did instead was begin to collaborate with neutral organizations, not the organizations that, from which those responders came, but neutral organizations that specifically look at issues like sexual exploitation and abuse, and begin getting back in touch with the women that we interviewed. Of course, we got all the contact information of everyone that we spoke with, and begin talking to them about a process of, voluntarily choosing, if they, decide to do so, to go to these neutral organizations not associated with WHO or UNICEF or whatever other outfits, with the response that can begin processes of providing counseling, potentially providing legal recourse for what occurred, among other services, given the sorts of abuse and exploitation that were described. Yeah.
That was it for us. The only thing that I'd like to say is that we're very much hoping to form reporting collaborations with African freelancers and African news outlets. So please do get in touch with any investigative pitches and ideas of how we could collaborate. And we're happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. That was quite a presentation, I should say. Thank you guys for going undercover for this. I have covered sexual exploitation before here in Uganda with a team that, of course, looked at how lecturers at Makerere University were demanding for sex from students for them to, to be given A's and B's. It's a big scandal here in Uganda, and also the BBC Africa, I did something similar to that in Nigeria. Covering sex abuse is quite difficult because, especially when you're doing investigations like the one that you did, you've got to have proof beyond reasonable doubt. How were you able to watertight your investigation just beyond allegations raised by the women? Like, how did you make your investigation so watertight that can be used, to prosecute the people who are behind these sexual abuses?
Well, shall I take that, Robert? I mean, first of all, I think it's important to know that it's not our jobs to collect evidence. It's also not our jobs to ascertain whether there was enough evidence for alleged perpetrators to be prosecuted. What we did do was try to corroborate as many of the women's testimonies as possible. We, as Robert noted, we talked to drivers, we talked to people on the ground, we talked to acquaintances of the women who confirmed the stories. In addition to that, we also had a lot of documentary evidence. In this case particularly, you know, the investigation was about how women were lured into sex for work schemes. That meant that we needed to at least try to show that the women were in fact given jobs at some of these UN agencies and NGOs. In one case, a woman showed us a money transfer receipt that she had on her phone from WHO. Robert talked to a lot of women who had name badges from the various UN agencies and NGOs. But in terms of the stories, you know, as Robert said, I think that it's important to, first of all, start from the standpoint of believing the women, and let the organizations investigate and let the prosecutors look for other evidence that they could use to prosecute the perpetrators. Robert?
Yeah, and
All right,
if,
thanks.
yeah, if,
Robert, do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I would just add that definitely, especially as we started to ascertain the scale of what was going on, and in part because of, you know, those ethical commitments that we had talked about in terms of guaranteeing that we're not revealing details that might endanger our sources, namely the women coming forward with these allegations, a sort of decision was made about the framing of the story. And this is a really important one, I think. It could have been framed as a sort of, oh, you know, there were a load of men, you know, however many men who did this, and these are just really bad dudes, and we got to track them down and do something about this. However, we made the decision as we kept sort of drilling into this and seeing, wow, this is so much larger in scale, it seems, than, you know, a sort of ragtag team of journalists, investigative journalists could, you know, really fully document. We made the decision to sort of frame the story as a larger systemic problem, a sort of wide scale problem that has to do with power dynamics and so forth associated with the response. So for us, really, it was about documenting this widespread practice that was occurring in the response that, by all indications, was much larger than just 51 victims. And so for us then, it was about talking to those women, as I had mentioned, and then furthermore, conducting interviews with other individuals working with the response, men working with the response, those drivers, senior officials, other individuals working with the response who likewise corroborated the fact that, yes, we knew about this. This was, in point of fact, a wide scale practice. And that sort of laid the basis for us to say with authority, yeah, this was a wide scale serious problem, and not surprising because communities have been screaming their head off about this since the middle of 2018. Yeah.
All right, good, great stuff. Robert, let me stay with you on this because did you have enough? Again, I'm coming from an evidence-based, you know, background as an investigative journalist. Did you ascertain that some of the women who came out to say that they were abused eventually got themselves on the job list? Like, where did you collect evidence to that effect?
Yes, absolutely, we did. And we did this via a variety of means. In a number of cases, we were presented with, you know, actual IDs, like a WHO ID. As Paisley had mentioned, there was a particular case in which a woman showed us a pay stub. Furthermore, very importantly, we were oftentimes discovering new sources, new women who were coming forward with these allegations by talking to somebody who, you know, because we had already seen an ID or something like this, knew was working in the workplace, knew was working in the response in some capacity, who said, yes, somebody else who was, you know, working in my same equipe, you know, in my same section of the response, also obtained a job or also, you know, was employed via these means. So in terms of corroborating the fact that women were working with these various organizations, as we touched on, looking at identification, there weren't really many contracts at this lower tier of the response. That was actually one of the problems documented in TNH's sort of Ebola business investigation, terrible bookkeeping. But the IDs, photographs of women in the field, you know, wearing their sorts of uniforms, wearing the visibles, pay transfers, and then also talking to their coworkers who, you know, we verified were working with the response, who said, yes, she also was employed via, you know, XYZ means.
All right, great stuff. Basically, if you also come through, there's always this question of fairness and being giving a benefit of a doubt to some of the parties who are implicated in this investigation? Were you able to reach out to them for, to get their side of the story on this, Paisley?
Sure. We reached out to all of the organizations who women named, and the result of that has been that all of them have promised investigations. Some of them went beyond what you would usually expect in statements, and understood the fact that sexual abuse and exploitation in general is underreported. So they acknowledged this problem. Some of the other ones that we talked to also acknowledged the fact that not a lot of money was pumped into a program and a network that was meant to prevent and flag some of this abuse to begin with. So yes, we reached out to all of the organizations.
Great. Also, there's always been this conversation of, if the people who have been, exposed in some investigation on, for example, in sexual abuse investigations, with concrete evidence of these women maybe mentioning their names, do you, in your own view, think that such people should be exposed with their details in the investigation, if you can really pin this person that they were involved in the sexual abuse? Is it okay? It's a conversation that's happening in the Q&A session, that we shouldn't say the names of people who we find in the investigations of sexual abuse related work, that we shouldn't put their names and faces out until when the courts of law have convicted them. Your thoughts on this?
Well, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think it's important to say that in Robert's reporting, many of the women actually did know the full names and nationalities of some of the men who they were accusing. We purposely did not use those names because A, the women didn't want us to, and B, we would have needed to reach out to the men, and in some cases we weren't sure that some of the abuse was illegal, and we would have needed to know a lot more about the specifics. So I think your question is whether we should have named some of the alleged perpetrators who we knew about. I would say no, because our sources specifically asked us not to.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, Robert, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, just simply put, I mean, there were obviously, especially very early on, extensive conversations about this, sort of on the other side. Well, we are getting these names, what should we do with them? Well, first and foremost, most important for us, as I mentioned, the sort of first do no harm principle. Just ethically speaking, we were conducting these interviews based off of the strictest assurances that we weren't going to publish details that would potentially put these women at risk of retaliation, or put these women at risk of, receiving stigma from community members as, oh, this person was hired like this, and so really it was sort of an ethical, just third rail, something we absolutely could not do. But furthermore, and probably more importantly, actually, as I had sort of touched on, for us, this really, as the scale sort of grew, it increasingly became a problem of the institutional failure and the institutional sort of dehumanization of different aspects of this response that sort of culminated in the sorts of abuse and exploitation that we documented, as opposed to being about, this individual, that individual did this and this and this and this and that. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think another question that is really interesting is that the WHO has since said that they're going to investigate some of the allegations raised in the report. The Democratic Republic of Congo is also going to be investigating the report. Are you therefore in position to help with these investigations, or you want to stick to the, you want to stick to your job of, we did the story, we did the investigation, we got the women's voices, and we put it out there. Go ahead and do your investigations. And what does that therefore mean about the impact of your story? Because I think that one of the things that you're looking out for is justice and fairness. So I just thought that, Robert, you could weigh in on this, and Paisley.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably, a couple important facts about that. I mean, obviously, we are absolutely in no position to sort of be on the phone with WHO and, start feeding them specific details that they can act on in their investigations. And, there are a couple of reasons for that. The most important of which probably was the fact that, part of the reason that, for my part at least, when I was on the ground, I was even able to talk to a lot of these sources was precisely because they knew I wasn't WHO. It was precisely because they knew this isn't, a guy who's working for WHO, who's running around, who's, trying to get information. It was that sort of independence as a researcher and as an investigative journalist that enabled me to sort of gain trust from those sources in the first place, who lost all trust on the part of WHO. And importantly, there were public reports. For instance, there was a gender analysis of the response written by a consultant called Neeti Kapoor with CARE that said in focus group focus group discussions, people in communities were saying this was happening, not victims coming forward directly, but people are saying this is happening. That was public in 2019. There were public conversations, not directly victims coming forward, but public conversations about this in early 2019. Frankly, WHO doesn't seem did too much with the fact that there were those sorts of public reports, and with the fact that there was obviously some level of awareness on the part of people working with the response that this was going on. And so that's part of the reason that a lot of the sources just sort of lost all trust in these organizations, and part of the reason that sort of independence as a journalist was necessary in terms of getting that information. And most importantly, and this is a really important point, I'm a white investigative journalist for all intents and purposes, parachuting into a context like Beni. I like to think, I do my due diligence and I'm thorough, but at the end of the day, I am sort of an outsider, and in a relatively short period of time, myself working with a lot of other, really serious people, we're able to uncover a lot of cases. I suspect that if WHO uses all the resources that it has and really makes a serious commitment, and these other organizations as well, shouldn't be too difficult to come up with some similar findings and track some people down, which indeed is what they ought to be doing as a bare minimum.
Yeah,
Thanks, Robert. Paisley, can you just come in and say something about this?
Sure. Just to add to this point, two things. I think it would be wholly inappropriate for us to, as journalists, to participate in investigations that are being conducted by the very UN agencies and NGOs that we're reporting on. That's the first part of my answer. You asked about impact. I think that we can have impact without necessarily participating in these investigations that the organizations are conducting. Sort of dovetailing on Robert's point, I think it's really important to say this. The Ebola outbreak occurred for nearly 2 years. During that time, organizations said that they had few, if any, complaints of sexual abuse or allegations with their workers during the outbreak. In the course of about 3 weeks to a month of steady on the ground reporting, Robert and another reporter and many of us uncovered, more than 50 alleged cases. I think that speaks volumes to what we as journalists are actually able to do, and what UN agencies and what NGOs have not been able to do in 2 years.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks, guys, for being part of today's today's session. Unfortunately, our time is fast spent, but it's really interesting to hear from senior journalists who have been able to be, uncover this abuse. It's quite disturbing that people are supposed to be helping people, you know, abusing them. And thank you very much, Robert and Paisley, for that. I really, really appreciate your time. It's been 1 hour, and we really are grateful. Thank you again, everyone who has been part of this you know, session. We really appreciate you. And we have a next session coming up in just a couple of minutes from now, about a minute from now. The session is titled World's Best Data Stories and Case Studies, Cracking Open the SA Lottery. It's coming up at the top of the hour. My name is Solomon Serwanja. Thank you all. Thank you, Paisley. Thank you, Robert, for this session. Have yourselves a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Thank you, Solomon.